During times of panic, there is rightfully a rush to mitigate issues, right? That's the whole point of what a panic means. Everyone scrambles, try to solve the problem as quickly as possible, or at least mitigate the effects of the problem. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. Most importantly, it's because people want to help people in need. They want to solve the issue. It's not really focused on resolving the problem over the long term. More specifically, they want to say, look, we can talk about resolving the problem at a later date. We'll circle back on that. Right now, there are people that are in need, and so the focus is to solve that issue or mitigate its effects. Unfortunately, when it comes to government action, the only way to solve a problem, from most government officials' perspective, is intervention, because that's what most people in government believe is their job to do. And by the way, the date to, quote, circle back and look at the underlying problems never comes. Now, I didn't know if I wanted to do this particular Monday Minutes, but I felt motivated because I had a conversation with the sponsor recently, who's a really smart person, definitely a moral person, someone I look up to. And I was kind of tiptoeing around my thoughts on this particular topic. And it just was clear to me that they, like most people, had not been presented with a counter argument to the massive government interventionist stuff that happens when there is any sort of crisis or fear of a crisis. Now, as you likely know, there was recently a $2.2 trillion coronavirus stimulus bill, which was recently passed. Bipartisan, which of course means the worst of all possible outcomes. And just so you know, $2.2 trillion, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of zeros. Even in the world of commercial real estate, if you put that number into a calculator, you'll see that it's not like a number you would typically see. It looks like an error, right? So the bill was passed. It includes some, quote, donations made by you and I and others like us to entities that you probably would think make sense if you were on board for this, the CDC, the small business loans and such. But of course, to get it passed, people in Congress include other things, $7.5 million going to the Smithsonian Institution, or $25 million going to the JFK Center for Performing Arts, or $75 million going to the National Endowment of the Arts and Humanities, like in the Dumb and Dumber scene. That's a big one. You may want to hold on to that one. I'll put the link in the show notes page to the actual bill, not a graphic representation of it. You can parse through it. So to me, this sounds pretty wild. And I know this is kind of the world, especially the post-2008 world that we're living in. We're accustomed to seeing this, but it's not necessarily that this is the answer. It just is the world that we live in, that would be what we expect when there is some sort of crisis. So I thought it'd be a good idea for me to propose the Hunter Thompson coronavirus stimulus bill, which I think is perfectly reasonable when you're looking at the scale of things, like in the sense of it's just as reasonable as the $2.2 trillion bill that has $75 million going to the arts and humanities. What would I do if I were in a position to make that call? Now, this isn't a cop-out. These are actually what I believe is the right thing to do right now. Number one, you're seeing a little bit of this. When real serious concerns, especially in the medical world, happen that impact people, rich and poor alike, you start to see the FDA drastically reduce the amount of red tape so that cures can be brought to the marketplace much more quickly. And there's a reason for this. The average cost it takes to bring a drug to market is somewhere between $1 billion and $2.6 billion. Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development recently put out a study that shows about $1 billion in cost and $1.6 billion of time, basically, to bring a drug to market. Now, this matters, right? So I'm not saying that there wouldn't be a virus in the world where the FDA wouldn't exist, but the likelihood that the challenges from that virus could be mitigated much more quickly are much more pronounced. Because of the fact that technology, very much like compounding interest, tends to compound on itself. So the rate at which you compound matters tremendously over 5 years and 10 years and 15 years. So it's a really significant difference that can be made. So I think that just like most products, or I should say all products, monopolies do not produce quality outcomes. So the FDA has a monopoly. This should be abolished. There should be third-party testing, and whoever tests the products in the most efficient manner should be able to make those calls, and adults should be able to make a decision based on what things that they take. And this is particularly true if you have a potentially terminal ill type of situation. There's many, many examples of this. Look, if we're talking about $2.2 trillion and saying that that's on the table, and I think that it would be perfectly reasonable, instead of going that route, instead of sending us all $1,200, why not just permanently forbear 2019 taxes? I mean, that's not out there in a different world than 2.2 trillion, in my opinion. That'd be something else I would do. Here's something else. Interest rates are critical, right? We talk about them pretty much every single episode. Interest rates have been significantly manipulated, not only in the United States, but also globally. And it's impacted the world in a way that we can't even imagine. It's impossible to tell where interest rates would be in a market environment, but it's very likely that without federal insurance, without the implications of bailouts, without the assurance that government entities will come in and step in if something goes super wrong, that interest rates would likely be much more high, which would incentivize savings. So this has a lot of implications as well. One of which is that the lower interest rates are, the lower it is for debt to be borrowed. This has had a profound impact on the housing market. This has had a very profound impact on the corporate debt and corporate bond market, in the sense that B and junk bonds, the yields for those bonds used to average 10%. Now they're below 5%. So we have experienced this massive explosion of corporate debt. The reason that this has happened is not that corporations all of a sudden are completely insane. It's the fact that the economics are such that interest rates are so low that corporations can borrow and borrow and borrow without having challenges servicing that debt. This is similar to the housing boom of the 2000s. It's also similar to, no, not exactly, but certainly related to the student loan bubble, which is taking place. Most of that is a result of governments insuring these student loans. And so there has not been a lot of underwriting on student loans, so you have a massive student loan bubble. So this may not tie directly into the coronavirus concerns, but it does in this manner. Because of the coronavirus concerns, the United States government is now, and the federal government, I should say, is now going to be purchasing up to $1 billion of corporate debt for the first time in the country's history. At least that's the way that I read the literature. This is like a Pandora's box that we're opening up that is just massive. So just to reemphasize, the federal government and the Fed drastically reduce interest rates. This takes place all over the world, so the global implications are significant. Corporate debt bubble blows up, becomes unsustainable, and it's a massive question mark. And then the government says, and yes, we're going to buy corporate debt now as well. So there's a lot of concerns about what the right thing to do is. And a lot of the answers for what the right thing to do is, it's like, look, this is what's best in the short term. And yes, there may be some problems in the long term, but we'll deal with that later. I think that both can be resolved. I think that the short term, the answer is removal of the red tape surrounding science and everything else, by the way, but we'll start with science. And the total stoppage of any kind of inflationary monetary policy. And you don't necessarily have to go the route of more control. It's just the matter that that's what governments are more inclined to. Like, you certainly could just abolish the IRS, for example, or at least, completely forbear the 2019 taxes. This may seem completely outlandish, and it is counter to typical Keynesian economics, but it's not totally ahistoric. One of the examples that people who are proponents of the Austrian school tend to bring up a lot, but not typically talked about outside of the Austrian school, is the forgotten recession of 1920. And if you haven't heard that term, I suggest you Google it. I did recently reach out to the author of a book on this topic to see if he'll come on the show. I'm not sure if he will yet. He hasn't responded, but I may do a Monday Minutes just about this particular topic. In short, right after the end of World War I, the Dow Jones experienced one of its most significant losses ever, 47%. Unemployment jumped from 4% to 12%. Incredibly pronounced price deflation, one of the largest price deflations in the history of the United States, or at least in the last 140 years at the time that it happened, somewhere between 13 and 18%. The businesses that didn't declare bankruptcy saw a decrease in profits of 75%. GNP dropped nearly 17%. So it was one of the most pronounced downturns in the history of the United States. And it was immediately followed by a 60% increase in industrial productivity within 12 months. Basically, we saw unemployment go from roughly 4% to 12%. And then within 12 months, it was back at 6.7%. And then within 12 months, it was out 2.4%, or basically full employment. I don't want to go through too much of the data because I want someone who is an expert in this particular topic to come on and talk about it, because it's a really important historical example where the government, to a large degree, did nothing in the wake of one of the most significant and pronounced recessions, which most people call this particular thing a depression, or at least had the makings of a depression, but it was over in around 18 months for sure. Like, looking at the metrics, the downturn was very comparable to the 1929 correction. The only difference is, or one of the major differences is, there was massive government intervention after 1929, and the results were the recovery took 135 months. Really, really pronounced. Now, I will say that in certain circles, this is something that's common knowledge. In other circles, it's never talked about. So it's really important, though, to know that the typical Keynesian economic thought is not necessarily the only answer. But when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if you have a print button, everything looks like a good opportunity to smash it. So I just kind of want to address that because there are other arguments out there, basically. And in the world of $22 trillion, it is, in my opinion, everything should be on the table. Now, having said all that, the Fed is always going to play the rich get richer and the poor get poorer game. And it's very unfortunate. What I don't want people to get as the takeaway here is that I am not for the middle class. That is not the case at all. I am always a fan of not inflating people's dollars away to uselessness. I'm coming out in favor of the middle class. I'm coming out with saying that these inflationary monetary policies, pumping trillions of dollars into a system in which there are hundreds of millions of people that do not have assets which increase with inflation, that is a massive disservice. That is a massive unvotable and unseeable to a large degree tax, which is very crippling for people who do not have assets that are inflation resistant. So, having said all that, though, I'm certainly not going to lose at that game. If the Fed is going to play the rich get richer and the poor get poorer game, then you know which side of that equation that I will not be on. And I'm an advocate of you as well, not being on that. But understanding that the game is rigged, understanding that you can simultaneously speak out against these policies, but also protect yourself by owning assets which increase with inflation. And hopefully we'll have someone come and talk about the forgotten depression or recession of the 1920s. All right, hope you enjoyed it. All right, listeners, you know the routine. This show is all about learning, making wise investments, and protecting and growing your capital. So if you're interested in these topics, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Of course, if you've already enjoyed a couple of great episodes, don't be shy, leave a review. It really helps the show's visibility. And lastly, if you're an accredited investor and you're interested in learning more about our investment opportunities, the types of deals that I personally invest in, go to asymcapital.com. That's ASYMcapital.com. Thanks a lot.